My name is Marguerite. I'm 36, and I've spent 14 years reading other people's numbers for a living. So when my mother slid a foreclosure notice across her kitchen table and asked me to fix it, I already knew, before I'd read a single line, exactly how much trouble we were in. "You're good with this kind of thing," she said. "Not please. Not I'm sorry to ask. Just a fact, stated the way you'd mention the weather." The notice was 41 days old. Green Hill Savings and Loan, the bank that had held my parents' mortgage since before I was born, had sent 3 prior letters that nobody had opened. I knew that because I found them later, in a drawer with the takeout menus, still sealed, sitting under a rubber-banded stack of coupons my mother clipped but never used. There was a coupon for a rotisserie chicken that had expired the previous August sitting directly on top of a letter that used the word default. I want to tell you I was surprised. I wasn't. I want to tell you I said no. I didn't say that either, not yet. What I did was pick up the notice, read the account number, confirm it matched the address I'd grown up in, and feel something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way a room goes quiet right before someone says the thing they've been holding back for 20 years. My mother stood at the stove behind me, not cooking anything, just standing there with her hands on the edge of the counter, watching the back of my head the way you'd watch someone defuse something. My father wasn't in the room. I noticed that before I noticed almost anything else, that he'd arranged, somehow, to not be present for the handing over of this particular piece of paper, the way he'd arranged, 8 months earlier. To not mention the hardware store was losing money until it had already closed. "How bad is it?" my mother said. Not a question with a rising note at the end. A flat statement dressed as one. "I haven't finished reading," I said, which was true, and which also bought me the 11 seconds I needed before I had to say anything that would commit me to a course of action. I turned the page over. There was a second page. There is always a second page. But to understand why I was the one sitting at that table, and not my brother, I have to go back. Not far. Just 5 years, to the spring I asked my parents for $11,000 and watched them decide, in real time, that I wasn't worth the risk. I grew up in Marion, Ohio, in a brick split level with green shutters that my father repainted every 3rd summer whether they needed it or not. He was a man who believed maintenance was a moral category, that a thing left to peel said something true and unflattering about the person who led it. My mother believed in fairness the way some people believe in luck, as something you talked about constantly, invoked at every opportunity, and never actually practiced in a way that cost you anything. I have one brother, Dean, 2 years older, and from the time I was old enough to count, I understood the household ran on a ledger nobody admitted existed. Dean's school trips got paid in full, cash, upfront, the permission slip signed the same evening it came home. Mine got paid this time, but let's talk about next time, a sentence I heard so often growing up that I stopped registering it as a sentence and started hearing it as a kind of background noise, like a furnace cycling on. Dean's car, when he turned 17, was a graduation gift, a used Civic with a bow my father actually tied around the side mirror, the kind of gesture you'd see in a commercial. Mine, 2 years later, was a loan with interest, written up by my father on a yellow legal pad like I was a customer at his hardware store instead of his daughter, 4%, monthly payments due the 1st of the month. A late fee clause I remember reading twice, because I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood it. I didn't resent it then. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I was quietly furious the whole time isn't true, and I don't want to build a tidier story than the one that actually happened. I told myself Dean needed more help because he struggled more, with school, with focus, with whatever it was that made him restless in a way I never let myself be. I was the responsible one. Responsible people don't need help. That was the math I did, alone at 13, sitting on the edge of my bed doing the kind of accounting I'd later get paid to do for strangers, and it held up for 23 more years because nobody ever challenged it. Including me. Especially me. I became a bookkeeper because numbers don't lie about who they belong to. I liked that a column either balanced or it didn't, that you couldn't talk your way around a debit the way you could talk your way around almost everything else in a family. I took my first job at 19 doing data entry for a regional trucking company, then moved to a CPA's office in Bucyrus, where I learned the parts of the job nobody teaches in school. How a person's spending tells you more about their actual priorities than anything they'd ever say out loud about them. By 28, I'd built a small practice out of my own house, 25 minutes from my parents, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough to have my own kitchen, my own quiet, my own front door that locked from the inside. I married young, 23, to a man named Tom who sold agricultural equipment and laughed easily and never once, in 6 years, asked me a single question about how I'd grown up that suggested he understood what he was asking. We divorced at 29. No children, no drama, no version of the story where either of us was cruel, just two people who'd wanted different decades and had the decency to admit it before resentment set in and made it ugly. My mother still mentions the divorce at every holiday like it's a recurring weather event, a thing that simply happens to families in late autumn. Has it really been 7 years since Tom? She'll say, apropos of nothing, while passing the rolls, and I'll say yes, and she'll shake her head slightly as though we're discussing an unfortunate frost that killed the tomatoes. Dean, meanwhile, drifted. Not unkindly, he was never cruel, never the villain in the way people mean when they say that word about a brother. He was just a man who'd been taught, gently and repeatedly, that someone else would handle the parts of life he found difficult, and a man taught that consistently enough will, eventually, stop trying very hard to learn otherwise. By 30, he'd had 4 jobs and 2 business ideas my parents helped fund. The first was a custom t-shirt printing operation that required, in his telling, more capital than projected, $11,000 of capital, as it turned out, though I only learned the specific figure years later. Doing the math backward from a tax document I wasn't supposed to see. The second was the lawn care company. Neither business survived its first winter. Nobody called it a pattern. They called it Dean finding his footing. I want to give you the early signal, the one I filed away and didn't look at again for years, because I think it matters that I had it the whole time and chose, repeatedly, not to read it. It was a Sunday dinner. I was maybe 26. Dean had just lost the second business, the lawn care company, which died, fittingly, with the first hard frost. The same week half his customer base stopped needing lawns mowed for the season and discovered they could have predicted that outcome 8 months earlier if anyone had asked. My father said, across the mashed potatoes, in the tone of a man stating something obvious and unremarkable, some people just need a little more runway than others. He wasn't talking about me. I understood that immediately. The way you understand a draft is coming from somewhere before you've located the open window. I understood that the runway he meant had length, real length, measured in months and dollars, and that mine, when I'd needed any at all, had always been measured differently. Shorter, with a fee attached for every foot of it. I didn't say anything. I passed the gravy. That was the early signal, and what I did with it was nothing, which is its own kind of choice, even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment you're making it. I told myself, driving home that night, that I was being uncharitable, that Dean really did need more support, that comparing siblings was a small and ungenerous instinct I should be better than. I believed that for a long time. I believed it the way you believe a wall is solid until the day you actually lean your full weight against it. The hook that tips toward trouble came 2 years later, when my father's hardware store, 41 years in the same storefront on Main Street, the same hand-painted sign, the same bell on the door that announced every customer since before I was born, started losing money to the new home improvement chain that had opened off the highway 18 months earlier. He didn't tell anyone for 8 months. I found out the way I found out most things in my family, by accident, doing someone else's books. A neighbor's husband worked supply logistics for the chain and mentioned, at a barbecue, that the Voss place on Main is barely moving inventory anymore. And I sat there holding a paper plate of potato salad and realized I'd had dinner with my father 4 times in the past 2 months, and he'd said nothing, not a word, not a complaint, not even the kind of vague unease he usually let slip when something was wrong. I called him that week, casually, asked how the store was doing. Steady, he said. Same as always. I let it go, because I had learned, by then, that pressing my father on anything he'd already decided to keep private rarely produced anything but a longer silence. And I had other things that month that needed my attention: a client audit, a roof that needed patching, my own life, which I was, at that point, still under the impression belonged entirely to me. The thing I didn't see, or didn't let myself see, took shape slowly after that. The way water finds the lowest point in a foundation long before anyone notices the crack it eventually opens. It started with small omissions, the kind that are individually forgettable and collectively unmistakable once you finally lay them end to end. My parents stopped coming to my open houses. I'd started hosting them for my own clients a couple of years earlier. A little side income on top of the bookkeeping, nothing major, but it was mine, a thing I'd built entirely myself. And I was proud of it in a quiet, specific way I didn't often feel proud of anything. The first few times they had reasons: my father's back, a scheduling conflict, a church thing. Eventually they stopped offering reasons at all, and I stopped asking, because asking felt like begging for an invitation to a thing I'd built without needing one. Dean's name came up in their conversation in a different register now: careful, protective, the tone you use when you're discussing someone you're worried might break if handled wrong. Dean's been under a lot of pressure. Dean's trying something new. We don't want to push him. Mine came up in the register reserved for someone who could handle anything you handed her, which sounds, on its surface, like a compliment, and took me years to recognize as also a description of a tool. Nobody worries about pushing a tool. You just pick it up when you need it and put it back down when you're finished. The hardware store closed the spring I turned 33. My father took a part-time job at the very chain that had put him out of business, stocking shelves 3 days a week, wearing a khaki vest with his first name embroidered above the pocket in a font that didn't match anything about who he actually was. He never once said the word humiliating. He didn't have to. I watched it sit on his face every single time he came to Sunday dinner still wearing that vest, because he hadn't had time to change, his shoulders set in a way I'd never seen on him before, like a man bracing against weather only he could feel. I tried, once, to ask him about it directly. "How's the new job?" I said, the way you'd ask about anything ordinary. He looked at me for a second too long before answering. "It's a job," he said, and the way he said it closed the subject more completely than if he'd simply told me not to ask again. That same spring, my own life produced its own small avalanche, the kind that arrives all at once and feels engineered even though it never is. My water heater died on a Tuesday, flooding 2 inches of my basement before I noticed. My car needed a transmission, $4,200, a number I remember exactly because I wrote it on a sticky note and kept it on my monitor for a month like a wound I was monitoring. And a client of mine, a contractor I'd done books for 3 years, skipped town owing me $4,000 in unpaid invoices, the kind of debt that's technically collectible and practically gone the moment someone crosses a state line. I did the math the way I do math for everyone else: clean, unsentimental, no editorializing, and came up $11,000 short of solvent for the quarter. I'd never asked my parents for money as an adult. Not once, not even during the divorce, not even the year business was thin enough that I ate a lot of rice. I want that on the record, because what happened next only makes sense against that record, against the fact that I was, by any reasonable measure, the child who'd never once asked. I asked for a loan. Not a gift, a loan, with terms, with a number I'd already calculated for interest, because I am, whatever else is true, my father's daughter in at least that one respect. I called my mother first, said I wanted to come by and talk about something, and she said, of course, come for dinner Thursday, in a tone that suggested she assumed I wanted to discuss a vacation or a new boyfriend, something light. I sat at the same kitchen table where, 5 years later, I'd find the foreclosure notice, and I laid out a 1-page plan I'd typed and printed that morning: repayment in 18 months, 6% interest. A signature line for a promissory note I'd already drafted using a template I used for actual clients. My mother looked at the paper like I'd handed her something written in a language she found vaguely insulting to be shown. She didn't pick it up. "We don't have $11,000 lying around, Marguerite." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking for the cash." I'm asking if you'd co-sign a personal loan instead, not give me money. Just put your name on a form so the bank extends the credit at a rate I can actually survive. My credit's fine, it's just thin. 14 years of running a one-woman business doesn't build the kind of file banks reward, even when every payment's been on time. My father was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that, looking back, told me everything before he said a single word, though I didn't have the vocabulary yet to read it that way. He set down his fork. "We have to think about what happens if you can't pay it back," he said. "We can't afford to take on that kind of exposure right now. Not with the store the way it is." I asked, carefully, keeping my voice as flat as I could manage, whether they'd co-signed for Dean's last business loan, the t-shirt printing operation, the $11,000 I'd only recently pieced together the size of. My mother's face did something fast and small, a flinch she covered almost immediately by reaching for her water glass and taking a sip she clearly didn't need. My father answered before she had to. "That's different. That's an investment in his future." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I had a future too, one I'd built with my own two hands out of a card table and a laptop and 14 years of unglamorous, dependable work, and that the difference he meant wasn't actually between investment and risk at all. It was between Dean and me. I'd known that, in some unexamined way, for years. I just hadn't heard it said out loud in those exact words before, with that exact phrase, an investment in his future, as though my future had already been fully funded and closed for new deposits a long time ago, before I'd even had the chance to apply. "Okay," I said, and I meant it the way you mean a word when you've already decided arguing won't change the outcome, and you'd rather leave with some dignity intact than win a point that was never actually winnable. I drove home, and I sat in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I went inside, hands still on the wheel, because I couldn't trust my face yet to walk past my own front window where the porch light would catch whatever was happening on it. I want to tell you I confronted them after that. I didn't. I went home, refinanced what I could on my own credit, sold a kayak I genuinely loved, a sea green 12-footer I'd bought myself the year of the divorce, the first real thing I'd purchased entirely for my own pleasure, and took a short-term loan at a rate that made my chest tighten every time the statement arrived in the mail. I paid it off in 11 months ahead of schedule because I am, above almost everything else, a woman who pays her debts, even debts nobody forced me to take on in the first place. I called it understanding their position. I wouldn't call it that anymore. That was the moment, though I didn't know it at the time. Not the refusal itself, the refusal I could have survived on its own, filed away as one bad night among many ordinary ones. It was the specific shape of the reason. That's an investment in his future. I filed that sentence the way I file everything, precisely, dated, in a place I could find it again if I ever needed to. I didn't open the file for 5 years. But something in me had already started keeping it, the way you keep a receipt for something you're not yet sure you'll need to return. What I found began with a phone call from my mother on a Tuesday in March, 11 days before that foreclosure notice would appear on her kitchen table, though I didn't know that yet, and wouldn't have guessed it from her tone, which was light, almost apologetic. The voice she used when she wanted something small. She called to ask, in the careful, sideways way she asks for things she's already decided she's going to ask for, whether I still did that bookkeeping thing professionally, as though I hadn't built an entire 14-year practice on it, as though it were a hobby I might have quietly set down somewhere between Tom and the divorce. I told her yes, of course, still my whole career, and she laughed a little, an embarrassed sound, and said she knew that, she'd just phrased it strangely. She wanted to know if I could take a look at something for your father. I said of course, assuming a tax question, a misplaced receipt, the kind of small administrative favor I did for them maybe twice a year without ever once being asked to bill for it. What she sent, 2 days later, in a manila envelope with no note inside it at all, just the papers, loose, slightly out of order, was 11 months of mortgage statements from Greenhill Savings and Loan. For collection notices I recognized on site because I'd seen hundreds of them for clients over the years, and a credit card statement showing a balance of $34,200 against a limit of $35,000. I read it the way I read every client file, flat, precise, The way someone reads a chart who has done this before and knows exactly what they're looking at before they've finished the first page. My father had taken a home equity line against the house 2 years earlier. I hadn't known. Nobody had told me, not at any Sunday dinner, not in any phone call, not even obliquely, in the careful coded language my family used for things it didn't want to say plainly. The money had gone. In 3 large transfers I traced back myself through 6 months of statements, sitting at my own kitchen table with a highlighter and a legal pad, into Dean's third business. A used commercial equipment resale operation that had folded in February, for weeks before this envelope landed unannounced on my desk. I didn't call anyone right away. I made coffee first, because that's what I do before I look at anything that might actually be bad. A small ritual that has nothing to do with the coffee and everything to do with giving my hands something ordinary to do while my mind catches up to what my eyes have already seen. I sat with the papers spread across my kitchen table in the exact pattern I use for every client, chronological, left to right, oldest at the far edge, and I let the shape of it become fully visible before I let myself feel anything specific about it at all. $11,000, 5 years ago, had been too much exposure for a daughter with a thin credit file and a clean, written, interest-bearing repayment plan already drafted and ready for a signature. $40,000, give or take, spread across a HELOC and a maxed credit card, had been entirely reasonable exposure for a son with 2 failed businesses already behind him and, as I would later learn, no repayment plan discussed at all. Just money, moved on the strength of hope and history repeating itself with nobody in the room willing to say so. I want to tell you I was shocked. I wasn't, not really, not by the time I'd finished laying the third statement down next to the second. What I felt was closer to recognition, the specific, cold clarity of finally seeing the whole shape of something you'd only ever felt in disconnected pieces before. The way you might walk past the same crack in a sidewalk for years before someone finally points out it's actually one long crack and not several small unrelated ones. Looking back, that Sunday dinner years earlier, "Some people just need more runway," wasn't an offhand comment at all. It was a description of a budget line that had existed the entire time, quietly, structurally, one I'd simply never been shown the ledger for. I did one specific thing before I called my mother back, because I have learned, across 14 years of this work, that the moment you discover something true about money is exactly the moment you should be most careful about protecting the evidence of it, before anyone has had time to decide later that it never happened the way you remember. I made a copy of every document, every statement, every collection notice, the credit card bill, and dated each copy in the corner in my own handwriting, the way I date everything that matters. I put the originals in a fireproof box I keep in my hallway closet for exactly this kind of situation, the kind where someone, later, decides the paperwork never said what it plainly said. Then and only then I called. "It's worse than late payments," I told her, keeping my voice level, the voice I use with clients who are about to hear something they don't want to. "Dad took equity against the house. There's a home equity line at over 9%, and you're 3 payments behind on the primary mortgage too. If this isn't addressed in the next 30 days, you're going to get a notice of default." There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then she said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about why I'd been handed this envelope instead of Dean, why it had landed on my desk and not his, why, in fact, it could only ever have landed on mine. "You always know how to fix these things, Marguerite. You always have." I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment after she said it, looking at the papers fanned out in front of me, and understood fully, finally, in a way I hadn't quite let myself before, that I had spent 14 years being good at the wrong thing. Not bookkeeping. Availability. I had built, without ever consciously choosing to, a reputation in my own family for being the one who could absorb a problem without making anyone uncomfortable about how it had gotten there in the first place, and that reputation, I realized, sitting in my own kitchen with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, had a cost nobody had ever once offered to share. I gave them one chance before I did anything else, because some part of me, the part that still wanted, at 36, for this to turn out to be a misunderstanding, a single bad decision rather than a pattern with a name, needed to hear them say it plainly. out loud, with nothing left for me to misread or explain away on their behalf the way I'd been explaining things away on their behalf for as long as I could remember. I drove out the following Saturday, having spent most of the preceding week rehearsing, in the car, in the shower, while doing a client's quarterly taxes, exactly what I wanted to say, and in what order. My father was at the kitchen table when I arrived, the same table, the same chair he always sat in, and, for a moment, looking at the new gray threading through his hair and the khaki vest folded carelessly over the back of his chair, I felt something in my chest soften that I had to consciously, deliberately refuse to let win. I am telling you that because I think it matters, that I almost let it go right there in the doorway, almost did the thing I'd done my entire life, which was decide their comfort mattered more than my own clarity, and let the whole conversation dissolve into something gentler and less useful. My mother offered coffee. I said no, thank you, and sat down across from both of them, my folder of printed pages in front of me like an agenda, because that's the only way I know how to have a hard conversation, with documentation, with a clear order of operations. The way I'd run a difficult client meeting. I laid out the numbers the way I lay them out for clients. Total exposure, monthly shortfall, the specific number of days remaining until the bank moved from notice to formal action. My mother nodded along without really looking at the pages. My father looked at every single one. Then I said the thing I'd actually come to say. I can help you build a plan, I told them. But I need to understand something first. Did you take equity against this house to fund Dean's business? My father didn't flinch, and that, more than anything else in the conversation, told me how long he'd been expecting this exact question, sitting with it, perhaps, longer than I'd been sitting with my own version of it. We thought it would work out, he said. He needed the capital, and the rates were good at the time. And when I needed $11,000 5 years ago, the rates weren't good enough. My mother's hands moved to the edge of the table, flat, fingers spread slightly, the way they do when she's bracing for something she can already see coming. That was a different situation. It was the same situation, I said, and I kept my voice even, kept it the voice I use for clients, not the voice that wanted to come out. It just had a different name on it. Neither of them answered that directly. My father looked down at the table, at a water ring left by someone's glass years ago that had never quite sanded out. My mother looked at my father, waiting, I think, for him to say something that would make the next part of this easier for everyone in the room, and when he didn't, when he just kept looking at that water ring like it might say something on his behalf, she said the line that ended that particular exchange, the one I'd carry out the door with me and turn over for weeks afterward. We need your help, Marguerite. We can talk about the rest later. Right now, we need to know you're going to fix this. I watched her face do what it always did in moments like this, the small, practiced shift from request to expectation, so smooth it barely registered as a shift at all, as though my answer had never actually been in question in the first place. As though the only real decision left in the room was whether I'd make this easy for everyone or difficult. I had been hoping, right up until that exact sentence, that I was wrong about what this conversation actually was. I wasn't. The hope left the room quietly, the way air leaves a tire, not a blowout, nothing dramatic, just a slow, total absence where pressure used to be, so gradual you don't notice it happening until you try to drive on it. I told them I needed to think, which was true, and which was also the first time in my adult life I had ever told my parents no to anything in real time, even a no as soft and provisional as that one. I drove home with my jaw aching the whole way, a tightness I didn't even notice until I was parking in my own driveway and realized I'd been clenching it since Green Hill Savings had come up at that table 40 minutes earlier. I didn't eat dinner. I put a plate together out of habit, sat down in front of the television, and looked at the food for nearly 40 minutes before I finally scraped it, completely untouched, into the trash. I called it loyalty when I drove out there that morning. I wouldn't call it that anymore. I think now that loyalty and obligation can wear the same coat for a very long time before you finally notice they're not, in fact, the same person underneath it, that one of them chooses you back and the other one simply assumes you. What I did quietly over the following 11 days, the way I do everything that actually matters to me, methodically, with documentation, without announcing each step before I'd already taken it. I didn't call my parents first to announce a decision. I called Greenhill Savings and Loan directly, identified myself as the daughter handling the family's financial review, which was true, and which I made certain was true on paper, with a signed authorization from my mother. Before I ever said it out loud to a bank employee and asked what options existed short of foreclosure. The loan officer, a patient woman named Renata, who had clearly had this exact conversation with hundreds of families before mine, walked me through it plainly. A loan modification was possible, but slow and not guaranteed. A short forbearance was possible, buying time without restructuring anything. A full reinstatement, paying the arrears in one lump sum, was also possible and was, as Renata put it, the cleanest option if the funds exist, which we both understood, without either of us saying it. Meant the funds didn't exist unless somebody outside that household produced them. I drafted 3 documents that week, sitting at my own kitchen table late into the evening after my regular client work was done. The first was a forbearance request for my parents to sign, buying 90 days and stopping the clock on foreclosure entirely. This one I would help them file, walk them through, sit beside them while they signed it. Because letting the house actually fall while I held the knowledge to stop it crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross, whatever else was true about the rest of it. Helping them survive the immediate crisis and refusing to become the permanent solution to the underlying one were, I'd decided, 2 entirely separate questions, and I intended to answer them separately. The second document was a letter addressed to Dean, laying out exactly what his businesses had cost the family in capital over 6 years, sourced, dated, the way I'd cite anything for an actual client, not as an accusation dressed up in administrative language, just a column that finally, for the first time in years, balanced. I never sent it. I kept it, instead, in case a day came when I needed to say these things to him directly and wanted to be certain I said them accurately rather than from memory and anger. The third was a letter to my parents, which I also did not mail. I wrote it twice. Actually, the first draft ran 4 pages and said everything I'd never said out loud, every Sunday dinner, every cosign loan I'd never gotten, every that's different, that's an investment in his future. I read that draft once, out loud, alone in my kitchen, and heard exactly how much of it was true and exactly how little of it would change anything if I sent it. The second draft was 4 sentences long. I read that one twice, and then put both versions in the fireproof box with the rest, because some things are true and still don't need to be said in writing to someone who, on some level, already knows them. I helped them file the forbearance the following Tuesday, sitting beside my mother at the kitchen table while she signed where I'd marked, watching her hand move slightly slower than it used to. I did not pay the $11,000, the $40,000, or any figure after it myself, out of my own savings or my own credit. I told my mother, on the phone, 2 days later, in a voice that did not shake even though my hands, holding the receiver, very nearly did, that I would help them navigate the entire process, the calls, the paperwork. Sitting beside them through every conversation with the loan officer, but that I would not be the one whose money or credit went onto another document with that house's name on it. I can help you save the house, I said. I can't be the foundation it's built on. Not again. She was quiet for a long time after that, longer than the silence after the foreclosure notice itself. Then she said, I don't understand why this is suddenly such a big deal to you, and I understood, hearing it, really hearing it, that some doors only look closed from one side of the frame. The reaction, if I can even call my own mother that word, antagonist, which I still struggle with some nights, because she is also the woman who sat up with me through chickenpox and taught me to drive on the empty road behind the church, arrived 3 days later. Not from her directly, but from Dean, who called on a Thursday evening to tell me, with real heat in his voice, that I was punishing Mom and Dad for something that happened 5 years ago, as though 5 years constituted some kind of statute of limitations on a pattern instead of simply a number on a calendar that the pattern had continued straight through. I'm not punishing anyone, I told him, and I meant it, calmly, the way I mean most things I say after I've already decided what I'm going to do. I'm simply done being the only column in this family's ledger that always, without exception, balances to 0. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he'd expected me to have one ready, which told me something too, about what he'd been told to expect from this call before he made it. That night I slept for 9 hours straight, the first full night's sleep I'd had in 11 days. In the morning, I made pancakes, just for myself, just because I wanted them, a small, ordinary, entirely undramatic thing to do while, 25 minutes away, my parents sat in their kitchen deciding what to do with the house I had. For the first time in my life, refused to carry on my own back. What came after arrived slowly, the way most real endings actually do, not in a single dramatic scene with raised voices and a door slammed somewhere, but in a string of smaller, quieter ones, spread out over the better part of the following year. Each one landing with far less noise than I'd braced myself for. My parents kept the house. The forbearance held through the 90 days, and 6 months later they sold the hardware store building outright, the one my father had clung to even after it closed. Paying property taxes on an empty storefront out of something that was equal parts hope and stubbornness, as though leaving the sign up might eventually make the decision to close it retroactively untrue. They used the proceeds from that sale to bring the mortgage fully current and pay off the home equity line entirely. They downsized the following spring into a smaller place outside Marion, a single-story rambler without a yard my father had to maintain on principle anymore. I think, though he would never once say it out loud, that some part of him was relieved to set that particular maintenance down. Dean and I don't speak often now. Not estranged, exactly. We still show up to the same holidays, still send the obligatory birthday text, just honest with each other, finally, in a way that doesn't leave a lot of small talk standing in its wake. He started a fourth venture last year, a consulting business this time. No physical inventory, much lower overhead, the kind of thing that fails quietly if it fails at all rather than leaving collection notices behind it. I haven't asked him whether it's working. I find, to my own mild surprise, that I don't need to know the answer in order to feel at peace with no longer being the one who funds it, directly or otherwise. My mother and I talk on Sundays still, shorter calls than before, but real ones, the kind where neither of us is performing for an audience that isn't there. She has never apologized in the specific sentence I once imagined wanting from her. I should have helped you when you asked, and I've made a kind of peace with the fact that she may never say it in those exact words, that some people simply don't have that particular sentence available to them, even when they want to. What she has done instead is stop asking me to fix things. Just stop, without comment, without explanation. From her, I've come to understand that's its own form of acknowledgement, quieter than an apology, but I've come to believe considerably more honest than one would have been. I kept the practice. It grew, actually, in the year that followed. Word travels, in a small town, about a woman who knows how to read a column of numbers and tell you the plain truth about what it says, even when the truth in question is hers to tell about her own family. I bought a small house of my own that spring, nothing large, just a porch and a kitchen big enough for one person and, occasionally, two. On the bookshelf in that kitchen sits the ledger my grandmother gave me when I was 12, leather-bound, half its pages still blank after 24 years, the one she told me, handing it over with both hands the way you'd hand over something fragile to use for whatever in your life needs adding up honestly. I'd carried that ledger and used, through 3 moves and 1 divorce, always meaning to start it properly and never quite finding the entry I trusted enough to be the first one. I finally wrote in it the week after the forbearance was approved. Not numbers. Just one sentence, dated, the way I date everything that matters to me. Some debts were never mine to carry. I'm done pretending otherwise. That ledger sat closed on a shelf for 24 years because I never had anything in my life I trusted myself to put in it. Now it has 1 page. I think, all things considered, that's the right number to start with. A family that only adds up when one person agrees to be the rounding error isn't actually balanced, it's just unexamined, the way a column looks fine right up until somebody finally checks it against the receipts. I spent 14 years being good at making other people's numbers come out even, and it took losing a house that wasn't mine to lose to finally understand I'd never once checked whether my own column did the same. It does now. Not because anyone gave me anything I hadn't already earned twice over. Because I finally stopped lending out the parts of myself that nobody had ever actually agreed to repay. There's a particular kind of family arithmetic that never gets written down anywhere, and that's exactly what makes it so durable across decades instead of collapsing the first time someone notices it. Marguerite's parents almost certainly never sat down, even once, and consciously decided to value Dean's needs over hers. If you'd asked either of them directly at any single point across those 5 years, they would have denied it sincerely, and that sincerity is precisely the mechanism that let the pattern survive as long as it did. Favoritism that announces itself gets challenged eventually, by someone, even if it takes years. Favoritism that hides inside the ordinary language of circumstance. He needs more runway. That's an investment in his future. That's a different situation. Never has to defend itself as a position at all, because it's never framed as one. It's framed, every single time, as a reasonable response to whatever happened to be sitting in front of them that particular day. What makes this story land harder than a simple tale of one unfair loan is the inversion sitting right at its center. The same daughter who was judged too risky to lend $11,000 to became, 5 years later, exactly the person trusted to absorb a problem 4 times that size, not with money this time. Since she'd already proven she wouldn't hand that over without conditions, but with labor, with specialized knowledge, with the quiet, unpaid expectation of competence that nobody ever thought to call a debt. That's the real mechanism behind being the reliable one in a family that doesn't actually reward reliability. You don't get protected because you're capable. You get used because you're capable, and for a very long time, those two things feel completely identical from the inside, right up until something finally forces you to pry them apart and look at each one separately. Dean isn't a villain in this story, and the analysis would be dishonest if it tried to flatten him into one for the sake of a cleaner narrative. He's a man who was taught, early and consistently, across years of small repeated lessons, that someone else would absorb the cost of his risk, first his parents directly, and eventually, by quiet extension, his sister. That's not malice. It's a learned expectation, reinforced every single time it worked, and it worked for the better part of 6 years because nobody in that family had ever once drawn a hard line that made it stop working. The real tragedy isn't that Dean took what was offered to him. It's that he was never required to learn how to do otherwise, because the family had already, without ever discussing it openly, assigned someone else the permanent job of making sure consequences never quite landed on him. The hardest truth in Marguerite's story is the one she finally names herself, near the very end, almost in passing, the way the truest things often get said. She had spent 14 years being good at the wrong thing. Not her actual profession, she was genuinely excellent at that, by every account, including her own. The wrong thing was availability without reciprocity, competence offered freely and repeatedly to people who had quietly decided, somewhere along the way, that her needs came with terms theirs never had to. That's a far harder pattern to see clearly than outright cruelty would have been, because it doesn't look like mistreatment from any reasonable outside vantage point. It looks, instead, like a daughter who simply happens to be good at this kind of thing. Only from the inside does it eventually register as what it actually always was, a role assigned once, early, almost accidentally, and then quietly reinforced for decades without ever once being renegotiated by anyone involved. What changed everything wasn't the foreclosure notice itself, even with its 41 days of unopened warnings sitting in that kitchen drawer. It was the single sentence that came directly after it. You always know how to fix these things because that sentence revealed the actual shape of the relationship in a way the original loan refusal, 5 years earlier, had never quite managed to on its own. The refusal could still be explained away, generously, as a single bad financial decision made under pressure. The expectation that followed it, years later, could not be explained away nearly so easily. It showed her, all at once, in one unguarded sentence, that she had never actually been seen as a daughter with needs of her own that mattered equally. She had been seen, this whole time, as a resource with unusually good follow-through. If this story landed for you the way it seems to land for so many people who write in about it, it's probably because you've recognized some version of that same ledger somewhere in your own life. A place where you're trusted completely with everyone else's problems and almost never once asked, with any real curiosity, about your own. The question worth sitting with afterward isn't whether your family loves you. Most families do, in their own limited, complicated, often well-intentioned way. The harder question is whether love, in your family specifically, has ever once come with the exact same terms for everyone holding it, or whether some of you have simply always paid more for the privilege of being trusted, and called that fairness because nobody had ever shown you what the alternative actually looked like.